All right, we're recording. This is Gateway API meeting for June 1st. Go ahead, Danian. We've got lots to cover today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Rob. So I want to take some time to cover gateway class optionality. I provided a reference here for a little more background, 262. But a quick background on the topic at hand. As we know, most everyone on the call knows, gateway class is a cluster scoped resource. The purpose of gateway class is to define a set of gateways that share a common configuration and behavior. The common configuration is expressed through parameters ref, which is a reference to a different resource that describes those parameters or that configuration. And that's really what's at the heart of this discussion and the issue that I'm drawing attention to. And the other area of the gateway class is the behavior, and that's really specified by the controller that's responsible for reconciling the gateway class. And there must be a gateway class, right? We can't create gateways without having a gateway class. I talked about what the parameters ref field is there, why it's there, what it does. And so, the issue at hand is, for one of the issues is for new users, right? Users that have probably been using Ingress for a while and not necessarily Ingress class, to go from interacting with a single resource like Ingress to transition into Gateway API, and now potentially having to deal with up to 3 resources or more, right? So our gateway class, the potential CRD that the gateway class references, and a gateway, and then 1 or more route resources. I think that becomes less of an issue for users as they transition or have already transitioned to Gateway API and start to form that mental model. But I think we could all agree that going from from a single resource to multiple resources, it's not going to be an easy mental model for a lot of our users. And beyond just the user, it's also for the implementers, right? So having to coordinate amongst multiple resources, it comes at a cost for implementers of the APIs. And so I just really kind of call out here is that, we should consider approaches that simplify the user experience, without sacrificing, the core features of Gateway API, such as extensibility. So I'd like to call out some prior art here again. Ingress can be created here. It does not require an Ingress class name to be set. See the example Ingress resource here. Persistent volume and persistent volume claims can reference a storage class, but it's not required. And so again, similar to Ingress with our storage system within Kubernetes, there's no requirements for creating a persistent volume or persistent volume class and referencing a storage class.
So this is a concept I'm not as familiar with. What does it mean, a persistent volume with no class? What is that, just kind of like the default kind of persistent volume in that cluster, or is there something more meaningful there?
Yeah, and by no means am I an expert in PVs and PVCs. I dug into the documentation for both that use a storage class, and and so my understanding is that if you don't specify a storage class for a PV, the PVC that that it's bound to must also be classless. So from a PVC standpoint, if you set an empty string, that PVC is then considered to be of no storage class. So there's that kind of requirement between the PV and the PVC. And my understanding is with a PVC, if that's not defined or defined as an empty string, then the behavior will be similar to this approach one that I'm going to go through, and that is that a mutating webhook exists to essentially create the storage class without kind of any user intervention.
Interesting. Yeah, because that's weird. I mean, the storage class would then, you can't create a storage class without an empty name. So it would just be some kind of virtual unknown reference. Interesting.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it
I
might
need
be,
to-
it might be up to, the implementation. Maybe it's some kind of auto-generated UID,
yeah.
something like that.
Okay.
But yeah, again, I spent time looking into PVs and PVCs just to understand, how the storage class interacts with these two resources. But definitely, if there's questions that I need to follow up on and dig down deeper, I'm happy to do that. One other piece of prior art that I want to call out is the storage class itself, right? So, we have referenced the storage class as kind of an example or a model when we created the gateway class, and I believe that the same was done for ingress class. And I really just want to point out that although there's similarities, in my opinion, storage class is very different in the sense that storage class natively expresses the configuration, the desired configuration, right? And to me, that is a big difference where gateway class, and I believe with ingress class as well, is that's a reference, right? It can't natively describe, that classification of gateway or storage. It has to point to some other resource that really is responsible for describing it.
Yeah, that was
Makes
yeah, that's a good distinction. I know we talked with some people from SIG Storage about this too, and my understanding, if I'm remembering this conversation correctly, this was more in the context of ingress class, but obviously gateway class had the same conversation while the same bits apply. And the idea there was that when storage class was created, there was no concept of CRD. So there was no better way. So they really just have a map string inside storage class, which is, essentially just as useful as annotations. And there's no great way to validate. There's no great way to provide feedback on whether or not something is valid or used or etc. And so our idea was, now that we actually have CRDs available that could include some validation, that was the concept of moving to a parameters reference. But it is a key difference and worth pointing out between the two, that storage class is really self-contained, whereas both ingress class and gateway class are not.
Is that I guess like they regretted doing that, is what we heard talking to storage class. So I guess that's one data point we might want to figure out, again, digging up like why. The other thing is like how this is almost like working around the Kubernetes type system to get a sort of like a flexible schema that's also checked. I guess how fundamental is that, like, versus the self-contained? Like, which aspect of the self-containedness do we need to rely on?
I think
If that makes
self-contained is,
sense.
yeah, I mean, I think the advantage of storage class and being self-contained is simply that there's one less resource that users need to care about and one less reference that can potentially be wrong.
Right, that's like a UX issue almost with working
Yeah.
around Kubernetes type system. It would be good to like distinguish between that versus like at a conceptual level, let's say somehow we improve Kubernetes to merge those two together. Like, is there something apart from that, I guess, that You get what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
there's the fact that we had to structure that way because that's how Kubernetes API machinery works, versus like, let's say we ignore that, there's some more fundamental issues around how we're modeling things.
Yeah.
This is just like a suggestion for how we're going to look at any proposal, I guess.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I think it's, it's natural for, the storage team to say, here is some of the challenges, with the approach they took, and they didn't have the option to use a CRD because, they're living with that decision, right? And we could easily do the same in the future at some point where we say, well, yeah, we get the benefits, of not having, the map string, essentially annotations in the gateway class like the storage class does. But it comes at a cost in the sense that now we're managing additional resources and the interrelationships between those resources. And so, every decision, has its pros and cons, right? So that's kind of the, the background, a little prior art that, that we can reference, and the couple approaches that I documented here. The first approach is very similar to what the storage team does, right? Where we make gateway class name optional, and if it's unset, it's considered to be of the default gateway class. And so I think this would make gateway class very similar to ingress class, along with storage class, right? And here's an example gateway. We have no gateway class name specified, but now we get into the issue of, well, if we have multiple gateway controllers of different types, we get into this race condition where these controllers are essentially fighting to satisfy that gateway, right? And I believe this is done by ingress class and storage class, and that is, we could use a mutating webhook to eliminate the race condition. Another option here that doesn't necessarily eliminate the race condition, but at least eliminates the loop, and that is introducing some type of gateway ownership status field. And so a controller would be responsible for reconciling the gateway. If the gateway class name is unspecified, it would then look to see, well, has a controller already taken ownership by reconciling this resource? And that would be, again, reflected in some new status field. And if that status field is unset, then the controller takes action on it. Now, again, multiple controllers could be taking action on it, and then you get into a race condition. Who sets this, status field first? But it is a fairly simple change that that does prevent the continual loop race condition. But this option here, the second option, is very much similar to ingress class and gateway class. And the point that I want to make here is, I feel like this improves the user experience for parameterless gateways, right? Because they just create a gateway, and because there's no parameters being specified, it does provide an easy user experience. I think from an implementer's standpoint, there's still that complexity that needs to be managed. And I also think that a majority of the production use cases, parameters are going to be required because, the way that Gateway API was designed, right? It's meant to be extensible. So the core APIs, are not as expressive as most implementations require, right? have another approach
I
here,
think-
but I want to pause for a second and we open it up for a discussion on the first approach.
Yeah, I like the idea of a default ingress gateway class, and I think we can really copy what we already did with ingress class. Of I think it's an annotation on ingress class that denotes that ingress class resource is the default for the cluster, and I think that's reasonable. But I don't think that this solves the issue. If I understand the issue you're really trying to solve here is you want it to be simpler to, well, one of them at least is you want it to be simpler to deploy an instance of, say, Contour or any other implementation of this API within a namespace, and not have to have that cluster scoped access. So you can think of Nginx ingress. This was another common use case here, where Nginx ingress very commonly was able to just deploy a single instance in their namespace. That's possible with ingress right now, but not possible with gateway. Is that one of your use cases here? Or
Yes, it is. And to elaborate on that, I just feel like, simplifying the mental model for users can go a long way by not requiring gateway class. All right, I think most users, like, they get what gateway is and they get what a route is, right? And by introducing the gateway class, and then that gateway class needs to refer to another resource, that's really where it goes from, okay, I get this, to, okay, I need to start to wrap my mind on how all these things work. And that's just from a user standpoint, right? And that's not even addressing the implementation side of things. And so, and what I express here in approach 2 is making what we call a class, how we classify gateways, more flexible, right? That we don't need to go ahead and classify a gateway or gateways using a gateway class, but to go ahead and give that optionality to say, okay, well, does an implementation want to express classification through a config map? Great. Through a custom resource? Great. Or do you want to use what we typically have been doing, which is a gateway class, which we know then refers to another resource? So, and that's really what this option 2 is about. And how could we go about doing that is, right now, I feel like I forget the field class name or gateway class name. That's really deviates from how we express references throughout other areas of the API, right? Everything else is some kind of ref, and it's a local object ref, for example, right? We did expand the parameter ref recently, right? Because that parameter ref in a gateway class used to only be a cluster scope resource, and then we said, okay, well, let's have the ability to go ahead and make that reference either namespace or cluster scope. So a lot, when I share this gateway class reference, I looked at that parameter reference of a gateway class and really borrowed the entire concept, right? And now within a gateway, you actually are referencing an object, right? And that object can be gateway class, could be a config map, could be a custom CRD. And I also share here in the example gateway spec for this field is, we could have different support levels. So if we want to go ahead and say, okay, gateway class, of course, is core. Do we put config map in core? Maybe, maybe not. If we want to, we say it's extended, or and all other basically CRDs would be a custom conformance level. And again, the gateway class reference looks just like the parameter reference of a gateway class, where we specify a group, kind, name, and scope. And we can default these like we do in other areas of the API to make the user experience of a a gateway class reference, very similar to what the experience is today. And here's what it would look like, right? So here's our gateway class and the gateway. And instead of calling out the gateway class by name, now we've got a gateway class reference and we have the name example gateway class. And again, all these other fields are being defaulted for a gateway class. Here's an example usage for a config map, right, where we create the config map, put in all of our custom parameters, and now this gateway, it references a config map. And I'm using a config map to express my class of gateways. You know, and some implementers would say, nope, you know, I want a kind of a structured schema. I'm going to go ahead and express my classification of gateways through my foo kind. And just like with the config map, my gateway class ref now is a group version kind, along with, depending if foo is namespace, which it is in this example, then I would specify the scope as well.
So if we could somehow represent a gateway class as a config map, what would be in that config map?
So it would be essentially similar configuration parameters that describe that classification of gateways as the gateway class parameters ref would. And so the config map could be, the config map could express the type of load balancer that you want to use, or how you want to expose your network endpoint of your implementation. So I may say, well, I want to use node ports to express or to expose my network endpoints of my load balancer or proxy. Or no, you know what, I want to use a load balancer, not a node port. Or I want to use, you know, if it is a load balancer, I want it to be an internal load balancer instead of an external load balancer.
Daniel, this I'm guessing these are the kinds of parameters that you don't want to make kind of like intrinsic parameters, like of the gateway class itself, because then you'd have a gateway class for each environment different. Every environmental difference would be a different gateway class, which I think probably seems a little bit like you'd be having too many gateway classes for all those permutations. Is that accurate?
Mark, in that case, where would you put those parameters if not in the class?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that. Maybe this is a noob question, but like for things that like, do the controllers have a way of basically having like intrinsic parameters? Like if you have two gateway classes and the gateway classes themselves comprise of all the functionality of that class. And so it doesn't require parameters. So the controller understands these implicit characteristics by the gateway class name itself. Is that a possibility?
I mean, it probably is, but I would see, like, based on the gateway class like name, like I would see then the names would start to get out of control, where you would say, you know, okay, it's either internal, and you know, you just keep kind of building these long complex strings trying to describe that, you know, that class of gateway, right? Because I'm thinking like how, again, kind of just going with the network endpoints of the load balancer or proxy, you know, in a bare metal environment is very different than in a cloud environment. And that's where I gave kind of a node port versus load balancer example. And so I guess, you know, I just could see that like the names becoming unwieldy, or, you know, we just need a way to express those implementation or environment parameters. And, you know, this same example that I'm going through was an area of discussion early on. And that's where we said, you know, like network endpoint type, like that's all implementation specific. It goes in the parameters ref of the gateway class. And I mean, the more that I've been, you know, implementing the APIs, the more I'm saying to myself, like, what value is a gateway class really providing? Like, it just seems like it's just directing it to another resource. So if that's what it's doing, right? A controller string to say, okay, what controller can reconcile this gateway class, and really the meat of it is really this reference to this other resource. Well, then I just don't see enough value in the gateway class itself to warrant the amount of work of the implementation, and then on the user side to warrant, how to connect these different resources within the mental model. But maybe I'm missing something.
No, that makes perfect sense. And just to like show an example, so like we have 4 gateway classes, and we do an element of kind of what you talked about, which was like we have a gateway class, internal and external one, a multi-cluster, a single cluster one, and this. But we've kind of drawn a line. Like that's as far as we're going to go as number of gateway classes. More characteristics or parameters that come up in the future that are not as large as those categories, we'll use parameters for that. But I can see like in your case where there's for on-prem.
Yeah, I want to distinguish though between sort of like somewhat like syntactic KDES type system issues, which is basically gateway class could be like inlined. Like it's just a reference to bounce through the fact that we can't have like a template parameter basically for gateway class, versus like how many are you going to create like 100 gateway classes, and who's going to be messing with them? Because those are slightly different problems. Like if you look at Mark's example, our intention is that these are kind of installed for the user, and there will only be a few of them, and most users, like let's say make up a number like 80% or 90% won't mess with it. So like they don't even need to kind of be exposed to all the machinery on the other side. Versus if you think your users are going to create like 200 of these, in which case they will interact a lot with the machinery, in which case like all the UX around the fact that it's like a reference that bounces somewhere else then becomes a problem. But that's different than just the fact that it is like kind of ugly right now and you can't do it in Kubernetes type systems. So that's why we have to have this reference bounce. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'd echo on that gateway class is relatively simple in concept if we consider it a primarily informational resource. If it's something that users look at, and here are the kinds of gateways I can deploy, provision in my cluster. That seems like a fairly compelling use case for that kind of global discoverability. Where I think we really start to run into problems that are beyond just UX is that use case of deploying a namespace scoped implementation. The access control part of this, where it's really difficult to say to a user of Nginx Ingress, well, now if you want to deploy Nginx Ingress, you actually need to be able to deploy these cluster scoped resources or whatever implementation it is.
Yeah, so that's like a third consideration almost. I wonder if it would be good to like write the different aspects down, because they might result in different polls in terms of the approach.
I mean, that's what that's the basis of our security model, right? Where we have our cluster provider who sets this who sets the gateway class, and we wanted to make that behavior intentional and not give users the power to deploy gateways. Like sort of application developers cannot deploy gateways, right? And like if we do a reference or make that optional, then I think we are like introducing a loophole in the security model as well, right? Or rather changing it if not a loophole.
Yeah, it's every feature is also a potential vulnerability, something like that. But yeah, that's a concern. It's hard because we're coming from this world of Ingress where something was already possible, and we're saying, hey, you can't do this concept anymore, which is a difficult sell. But anytime you open up those bounds, you would then, I'm thinking, let's say we do make gateway class an optional resource. That's something that I agree, could simplify the API. If we do that, we need to think about cross namespace references. If we're saying you can deploy this cluster scoped and you don't have a gateway class, you're basically saying that you don't have cluster scoped access. So we probably shouldn't let you reference anything in any other namespaces. But then that's like this other set of documentation we need for this other use case. I'm not saying, I'm not sure how I feel about this, because I have internally been thinking for a while that I would love to find a way to get rid of gateway class. And I even had that earlier PR that attempted to make it optional. But I don't know how to do it safely, like what you're saying, Harry, without either overcomplicating, you know, providing too many paths, too many different variations of the API, or just introducing security concerns. I don't know, and I'm glad. Thank you, Danian, for starting this doc and this discussion. Yeah, I definitely, this is my opinion. I definitely like the idea of the default gateway class. I think that's a really easy sell, and something like that, you know, comes from Ingress, comes from, I think storage class has, it sounds like storage class has a similar concept. I think that we should do that yesterday, you know, but the larger picture thing of if we can make gateway class optional, like the resource entirely optional, is a harder question, and I'm not sure. Like what I'm seeing with approach 2 is it's almost like you're referring to parameters. It seems like you're skipping the gateway class step and referring to parameters, which makes sense, but I think that could result in, you know, too many ways to do things again, potentially. And I've been talking for a while, but one more question here. For a config map resource, if you could target a config map and as your gateway class reference, and multiple implementation supported config map as a way to describe gateway class, how would they understand that this config map is for me and this other config map is, like, for gateway class, we have that controller name field. Would we have some kind of generic concept inside config map or any other resource type that included that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that if we go ahead and we say, you know, all the other resource type, you know, up to implementation, but for config map, if we look at that as a specific example to your question of, well, how would controllers differentiate whether they're, you know, they're managing that or not? And thought, you know, if it's an annotation or some specific field that we express the controller within that config map. You know, very similar to what we do with gateway class.
So, I mean, this has been very helpful, and it highlights one area in my mind is, what do we mean by a gateway class? And, you know, that has been intentionally left vague is my understanding, because it can mean a few different things. So like Daniel started and summarized it as like parameters and then behavior. And early on, you know, almost a year ago, we had this notion of that you could have gateway classes that would be same, but their implementations would be different. So sort of, you know, the object oriented world where, you know, like an external gateway class with, you know, some common behavior. I think over time we have realized that it's probably very hard to get there, is my view of the world. And, you know, now they are going, or like a class is always going to be specific to a controller, like tightly tied to a controller. Is that like understanding valid, or is that like too off base from the current view that you
I think, you know, my perspective is that that's going to be true in 99% of cases, maybe more than that. But that we still have this path for the, you know, large organization that may have infrastructure in 3 different environments, and they really value that consistency. It's not like I can't imagine a world where GKE just deploys by default this generic external gateway class. But as an example, someone as a user could deploy a generic gateway class called external in each of their environments and then provide their own custom parameters, controller name, etc. per environment for consistency for their users. So I think it's still a compelling use case, but I think it's primarily compelling for the really large organizations that make up a probably small, tiny percentage of users of this API. But I don't want to say it's impossible or will never happen. I just think it's the minority of cases.
Sorry, Rob, I missed the first part of it. What is the minority of cases?
Sorry, I think the minority of cases is that an organization that's deployed in multiple environments actually going out of their way to create custom gateway classes that are implemented by different controllers in different environments. So
right, I see. They're like totally portable.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would help to write some, I guess, like CUJs, and especially given light of some security related things that we were thinking of recently, like it's also helpful in that to look at like, okay, if you allowed such and such, then could there be a interesting consequence apart from enabling it, like given CUJ?
Yeah, but Harry, where I think you might have been going with that is if we could have, and maybe I'm off base here, but if we could somehow assign meaning to gateway class names that did not always require gateway class resources, and maybe I'm off base here, but
I mean, it's sort of that, right? Like it's like one is behavior that we want to sort of have similar across implementations, and then the second problem is, which is I think one of the drivers I see from Danian is when you have multiple gateways and each gateway has a different controller, right? Then in that case, you need a different gateway class for each of those installations. Like imagine Nginx Ingress. If there are 3 deployments of Nginx Ingress and they each have a separate controller, which is how you can do with Ingress class today, right? Like if you want to have 3 different, like in an internal or an external Nginx Ingress, then you need 2 different controllers and their proxy deployments. Then do they also have 2 different gateway classes? And imagine in some cases they have same behavior, but they are separate for some other reason.
Wouldn't that be just up to the implementation to kind of figure out what makes sense there? Because like Nginx Ingress, you could conceivably, not that it works like this today, like it could be in a clustered like behavior where it just has one class and then like n potential hosts of the ingress. Alternatively, if it didn't have that notion, like you would have to actually install a class per instance because it doesn't work like that in some ways. It's a gateway class because it's a cluster global thing. Like whoever's implementing that controller that manages it has to take into account what to do in this scenario, because you are installing a cluster global thing. So if the implementer is asking someone that they can install this cluster global thing multiple times, they have to work it out how that will be distinguished.
Yeah, that's completely fair, right? And like that's probably one reason why we are discussing this. And I agree to that. Like I think I agree to the simplification of it. What I think would benefit us is if we have a more concrete understanding of the class resource itself, because that way we can sort of understand like what is the value it brings, right? And
yeah, I think like maybe all the implementers can kind of lay out what they are seeing as their use of class. I don't know if in this doc, or just, it helps to see that concrete mapping, because I feel like there is differences between the implementations.
Yeah, and anyone else who's interested in or working on implementing this API, I'm curious, and not just what gateway classes you're providing. I guess this is closely related, but also if you envision users configuring params, if params are not really a thing, if params are maybe a thing, because if there's no real parameters, gateway class is primarily just a means of discoverability. It's a means of linking a gateway to a controller, and that's it. And if that's all we really care about, then then maybe that's something like that we need to just bump down to gateway itself. But if there's a lot of configurability at gateway class, if we're seeing people really dig into params, then I think that's pretty compelling. Like one thing that gateway class gives us is it gives us this way to attach policy at a higher level than we could to just a large set of gateways, for example. Let's apply this
I think
policy.
like there is also another way to look at it, which is that you can look at it from like, okay, what is your concept of a class? And then maybe it's this generic thing. Like another way to look at it is like, it is a cluster scoped resource. Therefore, anything attached to that, I'm saying that only admins can mess with, right, at that level. And then if you look at it from that sort of like reductive way, then it's like, do you have those options that you are only giving to the admin, and throw it there? That is where you will throw those options. Everything else conceivably should be a gateway policy decorator, because in the limit, like you'll have users who complain like, I don't want to have to bother the admin to configure those things. Okay, it's like, take all those. I'm not saying we do it, but like basically like, okay, push those all out to the gateway policy. You're left with basically things that only the admin should be configuring. And that is basically what goes in gateway class.
Yeah, that makes sense. Danny, one follow-up question here. Did you consider, so obviously ingress class is optional for ingress API because we had to do that for backwards compat. Did you consider an approach like what we do for ingress, where if ingress class name isn't specified, then we use this kind of deprecated annotation? But basically I'm not saying this is a good idea, but there's basically two ways to configure it, and they mean slightly different things. I haven't really explored this in detail. It may be a terrible idea, but just thinking that many people coming to this API are going to be coming from ingress. So if we have something that's familiar to ingress,
I don't know, Rob, but it sounds like we wanted to deprecate that, and
we did.
Going exactly the opposite.
We did. So okay, so maybe an option, again, this is something that I explored in PR, was a controller name field in addition to a gateway class name field, and one or the other, like I either just want to say, I want this controller to manage this gateway, and I just want to take all that controller's default settings, and I don't have a specific gateway class in mind.
But then in that case, wouldn't the controller just install the default settings and be done with it? Like, what would be the
right? But
kind of
this is specific. This is specifically trying to enable the namespace scope deployment.
Okay, so I think like namespace scope deployment, we just need to tackle just explicitly. Be like,
yeah,
this is how you do a namespace scope deployment.
Right, exactly, and I think they're somewhat separate use cases, but we can't get to namespace scope deployment without an optional gateway class. So they're separate ideas somewhat, but we need to tackle both of them if we need namespace scope deployment. Now, it could be valid to say we don't care about this use case. We recognize Ingress did this, but we don't need it here. And if that's a decision we want to make, then we need to build consensus and whatever. But it sounds like there's some use cases here. Damien, was that a use case that you were driving for here, or was it just more simplifying API?
I mean, I think the driver behind this, from my perspective, is to simplify the experience, and so, with this approach 2, I guess what I'm still, well, I guess I understand with approach 2, it sounds like the biggest concern is that, gateway class ref could be different references to different types, different object types, and now it becomes more difficult to understand the behavior. This, my counter to that was, again, this is what you see right here is consistent with the rest of the API. So if we're saying like, okay, there's concerns because the behavior may be different, maybe I'm not understanding it, because to me, this is consistent with the rest of the API. So if we have concerns with this, then we need to probably sit back and discuss the overall approach to the APIs of using this style of group version kind reference.
I think what's unique here is that we already have a class model in Kubernetes, and the class name model is, I wouldn't say widely used, but it is what I think is the most relevant prior art here. And so you're right, we have object refs all throughout this API and every other Kubernetes API, but I think it would be somewhat unexpected here based on the prior art for the class model.
But this kind of goes back to the prior art of the storage class, though. And we have to continue to say there is a distinction there, that I probably wouldn't even be making this argument if gateway class ref, was a resource that we can express, all the parameters needed, but we can't, right? So it has to now reference another resource. So we've got the prior art there with storage class, and my understanding that's what Ingress class and gateway class was modeled off of, but storage class.
Yeah, like I just wonder, would it be sufficient to just add that KV map into gateway class? So first of all, I think approach 1, I think everyone agrees, so we should just do it. I'm not hearing too much. Like in terms of like approach, I don't know if these are sort of disjoint approaches. It feels like approach 1 we're just going to do. So maybe we should just. Am I assuming too much? Like that just seems like a natural thing.
I agree. It was always my intent. We just haven't gotten to it. But I think it makes sense to copy.
Yeah. So we should just write down that. Yeah, probably we should just move ahead with that one.
Yeah.
Approach 2, like as I was saying before, like we should distinguish between enabling new CUJs versus trying to like make Kubernetes APIs suck less. So there's like the fact that you have to create this other resource and like reference it, but that in of itself is like fine. That's like awkward. But what happens is that whatever proposal we do, right, hopefully actually also considers all the CUJs that either A, it enables because we made a choice, or B, we want to enable, which is this self-deployment in a namespace. So I kind of feel like the first category, where it's just like trying to make Kubernetes APIs suck less, is like a bit less compelling than the second one. And then the second one, because once you make a change and all these new CUJs spill out of it as like a consequence, we need to be very careful that that is what we really want, I guess. And just a reference to that mysterious comment about security, but like we should be careful. You get what I'm saying? Like there's like making the syntax nicer, and then there is actually like a bunch of use cases that are impossible, and now it is possible, and whether or not we want all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with,
I
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
Okay,
go for it.
I mean, I was just going to say, like, we didn't put a ref here. From how I can think of it is, wherever we have put in refs, I think we have an extension point there, and in an explicit one, and we have thought through that. Okay, this makes sense. Gateway and gateway class were like historically we have thought them of to be having like strong relation between them, and that's why we didn't like consider an extension point there. And here as well, like we could consider making like the syntax better, but like the extension ness, I guess, of that is what I think we need to discuss if we want to change this to a reference type.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. When I look at option 2, I think of this as like almost like it's a params reference. And if you think of gateway class doing two things, one is it ties it to controller, and two, it links to params. I think the idea of a direct ref from gateway to params is sensible, and it almost feels like overlapping with policy, how the policy you apply at gateway, at route, at whatever, anything that you might attach, you're getting into territory that overlaps with that. But it doesn't seem to solve as clearly to me the idea of linking it to a controller, linking it to an implementation. I don't know, but I think I agree with most of the comments so far, just that understanding the problems we're trying to solve for. When I see this issue, I automatically go back to the namespace scoped implementation, because that seems like a really concrete problem. But what I'm less clear about is how many people actually want that. And if there's not enough demand for it, if it's not something we want to enable, then we have a much simpler path. And if we're really just trying to make the API more usable, that's great to understand, because it gives us better paths. So I don't know how we figure that out, but I think that's kind of a key next step, just trying to understand what we need to accomplish here.
Yeah, I typed in chat, like one thing that we should not forget is that it is the only place that you can have an admin only attachment point for policies in a consistent way. At least,
yeah, and I think,
I guess you could, but like since the ref could go anywhere, it gets quite convoluted potentially. Like if it could be a config map in one sense, and then like this other thing.
yeah, I think that's a key point, because it means anything that we do cross namespace, we probably can't do without some, cluster scope gateway class that was deployed that enabled that. But if you can just deploy this namespace scope thing that can do all the things, I don't know. Maybe that's a naive limitation. I know there's RBAC still, but yeah.
So it feels like if we wanted to, like, it feels like approach 1 for sure. Do we even have an issue that tracks it? And
I have an issue somewhere.
Going.
I do have an issue. Let me link it to this doc.
Approach 2, I think like we should figure out kind of what the consequences of this is, and then it feels like the namespace scope 1 may result in this or something, some changes in here. But we kind of have to understand, like, okay, in that case, it will look like this, and it will have these protections. and then I was joking, Daniel, but like approach 3, add key value map to gateway, like is that like only slightly horrible or like really horrible? Because if that suffices, it kind of lets us figure out like, okay, do we want to actually enable new CUJs, or mostly it is to smooth it for users, in which case like we could add that to the gateway class. It's not terrible.
One question for Daniel. I guess because the parameters about how the gateway is exposed, like node port, service load balancer, I guess those would pretty much be required for every use case. Like, there's no use case in which those, like, that needs to be specified, right? So every user needs to touch the parameters file if they're deploying a gateway class.
Yeah, I mean, at least, with the contour implementation, I see that, having a gateway class reference parameters is going to be common.
Yeah. And then does that also require the user to create a unique gateway class? Because they have their own unique parameters file, do they also need to generate a gateway class?
Yeah, so in today's contour world, an instance of a gateway class represents an instance of contour being the control plane, right? And then a gateway represents the data plane. So, right, your Envoy fleet. And to be able to support different classes, those Envoy fleets need to have different parameters. And I just kind of go back, if you go to like the contour docs and you see like there's an example of the getting started guide. It's like, okay, just apply this YAML manifest and it does all the magic for you. And it's like, oh, wow, this is really easy and simple and, great way to kind of kick the tires on contour. But what we see is like 95% of the users, like they just kick the tires on it. Then they say, oh gosh, well, we need, these specific load balancer annotations that came from the service that need to get passed down to the service that front ends the Envoy fleet. And if you're going to run, multiple Envoy fleets, they need to be listening on different container ports. And, it's all these different permutations that we have to deal with. And in today's gateway API world, that's done by having to create a gateway class with parameters that reference either a config map or a CRD that expresses all those different parameters.
Yeah, makes sense. And so the gateway class is likely to be named some unique name that whatever the user comes up with, because there could be many of them.
Yeah, and in this document I say user, but really, I'm not changing anything. Right? I mean, a gateway class would still be created by the cluster admin, and then the parameters ref CRD or config map would also be managed by the cluster admin, and the end users themselves just can either create the gateways or the routes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I think you raise a good point, because like 90% of the new users, who they may be a service owner, they may be a cluster admin, but they're just trying gateway for the first time, just like any of us tried ingress for the first time. They have to go through the whole thing just to get the most basic example up, which is quite a bit of work.
Yeah, right. I mean, you go from and right now within the contour community, we're saying, oh, okay, well, for those users, well, that's what the ingress resource is for, and it's going to continue to live around. It's like, okay, well, we're just kicking the can down the road with in my opinion, with that approach, right? And I mean, to me, the reality of going from, hey, look, you could, that this example snippet came right from the ingress Kate's docs, right? To go from, okay, wow, okay, this works, to okay, you got to create a parameters ref, you got to create a gateway class, you got to create a gateway, you got to create your route. I mean, it's
so how much of that is addressed by the default versus the more complicated one, I guess?
Yeah, I mean the default, like if you go to Contour's Getting Started guide, that that can be done without a parameters ref for Gateway API, right? So we just create the gateway class and the gateway, and the Contour, along with Contour's data plane, which we know is Envoy, gets spun up using a load balancer, all that stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, again, that works for the kicking the tires, but you know, we then look at the real world on the Contour Slack channel and see, you know, most people are having to do all sorts of different load balancer annotations or use different way to expose network endpoints for the Envoy data plane. And I mean, just look at all the different annotations alone for a particular cloud provider to specify, right? I mean, AWS, right? A million different things that can be customized for their load balancer, you know, that most people utilize.
And this would go into the class, or you're saying that, does Contour have a block that just is just like pass through opaquely for that?
No, so what we have to do is all those different like AWS, ELB, like what load balancer do you want to use? NLB classic, you know, do you want it to be an internal? Do you want to filter, you know, source IP ranges? All that has to be expressed in the parameters ref, which again, for us is either a config map or a CRD.
I see, but you guys don't interpret that, or you, I guess what I'm asking is like, that's an opaque block that you just kind of pass through. Or
right. So when we create the service that front ends the Envoy proxy fleet, yeah, we're basically taking that and then translating that to the annotations for creating the service. We eventually want to replace the service that front ends the Envoy fleet with you know, with Gateway API on that end, right? So we no longer create a service; we create the gateway class, the gateway, and you know, like a TCP router, for example, right? But that's kind of aside from the issue.
Yeah, it's. I think like one thing that would be useful is also, I think we're over time, so apologies, but like, you know, kind of getting understanding of, and it would be great if you could drop some links to the discussions on the Contour, is to understand like how many classes people are ending up with, like creating because of this, and then who is creating it. Still sounds like it's the admin, which is better, I guess, than, for example, Rob's use case of like everyone can kind of deploy it inside a namespace. That one sounds like you would end up with, if you kept with the existing class mechanism, you end up with like 200 classes versus like 5 maybe. Seems more tenable for a cluster scope resource.
Yeah, and I don't see tons of gateway classes. You know, for you know, typical multi-cloud environment, I think, you know, that's where we get into maybe a dozen classes overall, right? Where they'd have like an internal and external per environment, right? And let's say, you know, large enterprise customers, like, okay, I've got a couple cloud providers and I've got, you know, my internal environment as well. And so, you know, for each cloud provider, I've got the external and internal. So let's say if it's, you know, in this example, it's maybe 6 to 8 or something like that of gateway classes. But then you kind of compound that over, okay, each of those gateway classes references a parameter ref, and then the number of gateways that reference each of those gateway classes, and the confusion, so forth, just kind of grows exponentially.
I see, but like gateway class is 1-to-1 with the params, so at least that is not going to be a multiplicative growth. I think like what it does sound like though is that the getting started experience is not super smooth. I do wonder if the default will fix some aspects of it. Sounds like it's not entirely sufficient. we should think about like how we can make it smooth. Maybe if it's packaged as like a Helm chart, it's like easier. Isn't that how Contour is? I don't know. Like,
well, we're doing it with an operator, and so the kicking the tires and getting started isn't, in my opinion, so much the issue, because right, we created a gateway class called public. We create the gateway, which creates an instance of Contour, or I'm sorry, of Envoy. The gateway class creates an instance of Contour. So that's not, in my opinion, that's not an issue. It's again, those users that are now saying, okay, cool, we kick the tires. Well, now here's our environment, right? We need an internal and an external. The external needs to be an NLB. The internal is a classic load balancer. The internal then also needs a filter on these source IP ranges. We need to go ahead and set the proxy protocol for this provider, but not for these providers. There's a lot of parameters when you're dealing with each of the different cloud providers configuration that, when people are kicking the tires, it's just like, okay, great, this works. And then in reality kicks in, and it's like they've got all these requirements of filtering, source ranges, providing the client IP, and so they have to use a proxy protocol and all these parameters for each and every different environment. It's not just one or two. It's the list keeps growing.
I see, but let's see. So it definitely is a need for someone to edit the parameters, and by merging it into gateway class, that will be easier. But they still have to like figure out all those parameters. It's not, and that doesn't just come off the shelf. Although you could say the operator should default based on the environment, but maybe that's not detectable from your operator.
Yeah, there's
Or they
certain
have
things that we
use
can't.
cases.
Yeah, no, there's certain things that we can detect and set automatically for the different providers. There's no doubt about that. We can't detect like what LB type that they want to use when Amazon supports 3 different LBs, right? That's just one example there. But things like, is this Amazon? Okay, we'll set proxy protocol. But again, there's some users that's even hard to default, because there's some users that don't care about whether preserving their client IP or not. And so you get in that setting where it's like, really need to expose this, because we want to give people that option, because there's some people that want it and other people that don't. So it can be challenging.
I see. Yeah, it would be great if we could link those comments in here.
Yeah. Why don't I create a kind of a section to this? Yeah, why don't I'll add to this document. It just kind of talks a little bit about, give kind of just like an implementation example using Contour. And we can discuss it further.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be really helpful. All right. Well, I think we're past time here, but yeah, thank you for the great discussion here. Yeah, I'll follow up on that doc as well. I'm really interested. I have been interested in a while in finding alternatives to gateway class or optional ways to do that, but understanding the problems would be helpful. So yeah, thank you. Cool. All right, I think that's all for today. See you.